Thanks, Kate. I would now like to welcome up to the stage Abby Maxman, President and CEO of Oxfam America, and Charles Owubah, CEO of Action Against Hunger. Can I actually have you here? And I'll have Charles there. Thanks so much to you both for being here. I also just wanted to make a quick note. That Jess Fonzo was supposed to be on this panel as well, but she unfortunately had a duty with her school. She's a dean at Hopkins as well and got called into a meeting last minute. So apologies that she's not here. Let me just pick this up real quick. We are here to talk about one of the more ongoing crises in the food system, which is climate change. And so I think it's important that we not forget this topic when we are in the midst of, again, yet another crisis, right? We've been talking a lot about the food price crisis, everything about Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. But I'd like to step back from that a little bit and talk a little bit more about the longer term impacts that we're seeing from climate change. So obviously both of your organizations work in many communities all around the world. So I'd love to start by talking a little bit about what your beneficiaries, what your communities are feeling from climate change. What do you hear when you talk about this topic to your communities? Abby, we'll start with you.
Thanks so much. It's good to be here. And it's so important to be talking about the systems. And that's been a thread of the day. And it's putting the spotlight on that is just fundamental right now, because what the communities we work with and our partners are saying repeatedly is there's this supercharged compounding impact of climate on COVID, all of the C's that have already been mentioned, but putting the human face to who is affected disproportionately. We know it is Black and brown communities. We know it is disproportionately women. We know that as you go and experience the compounding impact of climate, the same people are disproportionately feeling the effects, and they are least responsible for the causes of climate change and the impacts they're experiencing. And so from the Horn of Africa, we know that the data, we know the numbers, we've heard them throughout the day, but there's individual people whose livelihoods are being affected. And just one of a pastoralist named Kali Daoud in Jubaland, Somalia, who spoke with us just the other day about having 150 cattle before these repeated shocks, the climate of drought, and he now has 0. This is a 75-year-old pastoralist who has managed to adapt and have a livelihood, and his livelihoods are decimated, and has talks about we're staring hunger in the face. And so the face of hunger is everywhere right now, from the Horn of Africa, from what we're seeing in the Central America Dry Corridor, where from 2019 and 2020 alone, before what we've been seeing, they experienced the highest increase in hunger. And we've heard the numbers throughout the day already of what's happening to people everywhere, from Bangladesh to the Horn to the Sahel. And the stories and the human faces and the women who are making those impossible choices. And for myself as a mother of 3, I often think about that choice of, I would have to choose of who gets to eat of my children and when. And those are truly impossible choices. And we're watching that increase significantly at a time when we know these are truly solvable problems. They are complex, they are huge, they are growing, yet with a combination of policies and political will and investment and diversification and localizing sustainable food systems, real changes can happen.
Yeah, I want to just talk a little bit about Somalia. If any of you got a chance to read my colleague Sarah Jerving's really amazing reporting out of Somaliland, she was on a reporting trip there just last month, I believe, and just really stark images and stories, of people that are being forced to make those choices. And with climate change, I think we're seeing as well, every time people are forced to cope after, a bad season, after yet another drought, and animals are dying off, people have fewer resources to fall back on, right? They sell other resources and you're left with nothing at the end. Yeah. Charles, I'd love to hear from you. What are your communities thinking about when it comes to climate change, and how is that affecting the way that you all are thinking about responding in those places?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here to share some thoughts. We're seeing the effects when we wake up in the morning and we go to our nutrition and health centers, and we have women who have lined up there with their children in their arms, extremely weak from malnutrition. And what are they doing? Waiting to be helped. What happened to them? Because these mothers coming from places where they've seen severe drought, or in cases, flooding, and so the children have not been fed or have not been fed properly for weeks. And so they have very weak bodies, cannot even take in food. So they line up, we walk up, there they are. We have to help them right there. What else are we seeing? Just last year, climate change what it did was to bring the perfect breeding ground for locusts. So we saw locust swarms the size of Los Angeles descending on parts of East Africa and devouring crops. That's what happens to people in the area. We're seeing many of these things happen in Ethiopia. What we are seeing today with the food prices going up, but also part of it is the energy issues. We're talking of a food basket now having been increased by 66%. If you live in that community and you have food basket increasing by 66%, what are you going to do to feed your child? Those are some of the issues. So for there's one message that I want to send is the urgency of the issue. This is so urgent. This is not yesterday. This is today. And there's something that we need to do to be able to help these people. That's what I would say.
I think that urgency message is so important because, as we've been discussing throughout today, it really is one crisis on top of another. And it's kind of easy to forget about the last crisis because you must respond immediately. Abby, how would you think about trying to keep attention on this issue of climate change when, we have shock after shock after shock? We had COVID, obviously now Ukraine. How do we keep the world's attention on this? I think we've proven as a global community we know exactly what we need to do, but of course it's not happening.
Well, all of us need to keep thinking about how to keep the world's attention. As you say, it's almost a whiplash of crisis to crisis to crisis. And I think people's absorption capacity, those who want to support and engage and get involved and give money, they don't even know what to give to. People want to do the most good, and to help them do that is really critical. I think there's a combination of being able to explain and help people understand both what individuals can do when you talk about things like food systems, that everybody can make a difference, and look at, consumer education and one's own individual agency and what you can do in your home to make a difference, whether it's here in the United States or elsewhere. At the same time, giving that understanding of policy solutions that can really matter and help people understand the supply chain and the value chains and how it works. We know that a driver of what people eat is what is produced and subsidized. And so we know that there's just 3 crops: wheat, maize, and rice, that account for about 1/3 of calories that the world's population consume. And so when people understand, when you talk about diversifying and localizing what people eat, helping make that palpable and understandable. Like, what do you mean when we talk about these giant numbers that can feel so overwhelming, and we're going to fix the what, and my action is going to make a difference. So helping people both individually, collectively, and all of us, the collaboration and the partnerships that are fundamental, so that we can incentivize different ways of diversifying and localizing production that is much more sustainable and makes food access more accessible. And also those issues about purchasing power and how you can localize and make food accessible locally.
Right. Yeah. Charles was, talking about how expensive food has gotten. And obviously the whole world is seeing that. Here in the United States, people are constantly talking about, how much supermarket prices have gone up. Charles, how are you thinking about the ways to build more resilience in communities, both longer term, but also to respond to these emergency shocks and provide support to people that, you know, can no longer buy what they need to buy at the store?
So I think where we are today, anytime we go into a place where we're doing some programs, we always have to have a long lens to be able to see into the future. So it's not just the emergency program that we are doing today, but needing to look into the future. I say so because the history of, and I've been doing this for the last 20 years, and part of our challenge that we see is that there is an emergency programming. When you finish with the emergency programming, the funding is not available. Then there's development funding. By the time we have the development funding come in, guess what? Whatever we started in that place is no longer working. Those activities are not sustainable. So 5, 6 years later, we go to the same place with emergency funding to be able to do that. That has to stop. The transition between emergency and development, I think one of our speakers said it, it's not a straight line. Sometimes it's cyclical. So whatever we start to do today, we need to be able to look into the future. That's where the whole thing starts. Another part of it is when it comes to climate change, the work that we do today, it is extremely important to look at what are we cropping. So let me give you an example. If you look at the Sahel and many of these areas that we work in, we need to go back to growing those indigenous crops because they've had hundreds of years to be able to adjust to the environment. We know that. So many places that we work in is not, it shouldn't be maize. In fact, it's millet and sorghum. Why? Because they have adjusted easily. Maize is a pumped crop. Maize requires a lot of water. Maize requires a lot of nitrogen. It depletes the nitrogen within a short time. Why would you want to grow maize in an area that is so dry? So part of it is the work that we do in those areas to be able to go forward. And maybe the last point to add is needing for us to be able to look at the agroforestry and the agroecological systems. Why? Because we know that with climate change, when the rains do come, they come in torrents, pouring so hard. When we're able to integrate trees into the cropping system, guess what they do? We all know that we did biology, we did all the work, right? So the rain comes in there, it absorbs that power. It gives enough time for the water to be able to percolate into the soil to feed underground aquifers. We know that. Some of the trees actually are nitrogen fixing. They're taking atmospheric nitrogen to fix nitrogen in the soil. So we are reducing our dependence on nitrogen. Why would we not do that? Some of the trees, actually, the leaves, serves as fodder for animals. Why are we not doing more of those issues? So I'm saying, as we go forward, looking back what we've done, there are great examples that we need to be able to do and perhaps go to scale. The time is not here to be able to find out, is this going to work? We've been here for the last 20 years. Scale is important. Whether it's come from Abby and I bodies, right? Whether it's coming from Oxfam or any other place, we need to take it and go to scale. That's one way that I think we can be able to see a lot more work being done in this area.
What are some of the barriers on the ground if you're trying to convince a farmer that was growing maize that actually they should be growing sorghum and millet instead? Is that a hard argument to make?
In some cases it is, because I think we've introduced the foreign crops, right? Most of the time we do taste, we're trying to which one tastes good and others. But it's difficult because they've gotten used to maize now. So it takes time, and that's where we have to work with the community. Sometimes we show them examples. Sometimes we engage with them, like, look, in this area, millet was the one that was being grown. But what is the nutritional value of millet and corn and sorghum? So by making it available to them and engaging with them, they're more than happy to be able to pick it up. But we have to incentivize them to be able to move away from some of these. It's all about incentives that we need to be to tell the ordinary farmer to be to go for. And then if we can help them, in some cases, the smallholder farmer, incentives like irrigation. We've mentioned the smallholder farmer here, but I would say one of the things we need to do more of, irrigation for the smallholder farmer. $170 US, less than $200. We are able to irrigate 2 acres of land. And we know that that's the only reason why production is low. If you look at the hydrological map of many of these places, we have enough streams and water. There's water underground. $200 with a treadmill? we can crop 2 acres of land. So those are some of the things, Theresa, that we have to work with the community and tell them, and they buy into that when we do that.
How about you, Abby? How are you thinking about that issue of, you know, incentivizing farmers to take up more climate-friendly practices?
Well, it's building on Charles's point. There's looking at the system as a whole, because it is a system, and we see what farmers grow is what governments subsidize. And so there's a connection there. And so we have to end what international research and development actors are supporting. So all of us, this is a moment, and it's a critical moment, as I think we all agree, to see, is this time for a strategic reset in what is incentivized in the whole system? And so every action, if farmers are incentivized and if subsidies are to grow locally, and diversify and look for sustainable and climate resilient crops. This is an opportunity, while also investing in making sure that people have access to food now. And so it's looking at the suite of approaches and this, you know, getting away from the false humanitarian or development. A farmer does not think of themselves as a humanitarian or a development. They're a human being, and they're farmers who are working to support families and livelihoods. And so we can kind of reset how we talk about it, how we incentivize, invest, diversify, and localize.
What more needs to be done to break down those silos when we're thinking about climate change? We were talking a little bit earlier about how, you know, in the UN Food System Summit, part of the reason behind that event was to bring together folks from so many different areas and say we do really all have a common agenda here. What more needs to be done there? Because obviously we're not there yet.
Well, you know, again, looking at from a systems, you know, from farmer to system and farmer, you know, when we look at some of the financing instruments for climate, there was a study recently of looking at the Green Climate Fund, and on average, it took 21 months for a project to be approved and get resources out at a macro level, you know, at that level. Now, 21 months, you know, we know that there's an urgency of now, not just on responding to humanitarian needs, but in transforming the systems. And so we have to look at how there's not this dizzying array and complexity of how the financing that does exist gets accessed, concurrent with making sure the investment in what people need now. How do we drive down purchasing power? How do you get cash and food accessible to people who need it now so that they can invest back, and look at even some links between what is grown and what school feeding programs are happening locally. And so making those links, every one of us, from the private sector example to public and government and civil society, and making sure we're having the voices of those who are most affected at the table to help inform what's happening and where investment flows.
Mm-hmm. Charles, I want to talk a little bit more about that investment piece. What more needs to be done to make sure that the investment actually is getting directed to where it needs to go?
So part of it has to do with the kind of programs that our donors are funding. You know, having done this for 20-something years, if I wear my lens, I'm looking at it, the proposal, I'm finding out, what would this lead to? Because we know the resilience framework we've used for all these years. Is it in there? What would that lead to? When are you stopping? If you come back 5, 10 years later, are you going to do the same thing? So for me, part of it is also making sure that what the donors are funding with climate change, which is here today, needing to be sure that whatever we do today, we have a climate lens to all the proposals that we're actually pushing it out. It is critical. So we need to be able to do that. And then if you want to go into some details, to what extent is it actually helping within the community, and are people actually going to be fed well, and what does it mean? Part of this is also, for me, I will go even back to how the children are fed as part of the whole process there. Stunting, if you ask me. The reason why we have inequality is because we have children who have stunted brains. So part of the work we do today is to make sure we deal with stunting today. Because the data is clear. A child whose brain is stunted, we know that he or her earning capacity is going to be low. We know what it means for the offspring coming from this child. So as part of the work that we do while we're trying to look at financing and others, for the future, we need to make sure that we build these into our programs and to be able to do it well. Perhaps the last thing to share with you all is the data is so clear. If we invest $1 in hunger programming, the fact that we're going to get $16 US in return is the reason why I want to speak with my buddy from Pepsi-Cola and engage with you, WFP and others, to be able to see more investment today. Abby, if I can say this, the money is not enough. Don't we need more money here?
Well, I would say yes, but to some of the data points, look at what governments are investing, you know, the percentage of a percentage point. We have the ability, the world has the ability to produce enough food and make sure it's accessible, but we know that there needs to be a reset of what people prioritize, what gets invested in. We all have to use our voices to influence whether it's our governments and multilaterals and how those systems flow, because yes, we absolutely need more investment. And I think there's a false narrative that there are not enough resources in the system. We get into income inequality and other underlying issues that are driving how money flows in certain countries and contexts, and who is able to finance and resource at the levels that is possible. And I think that the resources are there and can be there with political will, public pressure, mobilizing action, and our collective partnerships.
And I think one of the things that I've always found interesting about climate finance in particular is it's really difficult to track, right? Companies, donors, everyone can make announcements, and it's really challenging to determine if that money was spent, if it was spent the way that they said it was going to be spent. I did a story, I think last year, looking at the food systems aspect of climate finance, and it's really difficult to tell where the money is. And I think that makes this all the more challenging, right? Because you want to be able to call people out. You want to be able to say, oh, you did a good job, or, where have you been? You need to step up. But the data is really challenging. And we were hoping to have Jess talk a little bit about the data. So unfortunately, that piece of this conversation is missing. But I think that's a key part, right? Because how do you make the argument if you don't have the data for what's currently happening?
Well, and that's where we have an opportunity, all of us, to work together to share data, be data informed about anecdotes. We know that the stories are happening. We have data, and how do we connect the dots on data? But absolutely, it would be great to dive. It's necessary to dive more deeply into that. Sure, Charles, you have thoughts on that?
I think so. I think that the tracking part of it is very important, Theresa. Making sure that we understand, the transparency part of it, but being able to track it from point A to point B. This is where we have the challenges. And this is where even going back to use satellite, imagery analysis and others. So the funding is being done in a particular place. We can do those, and we can tell the size of streams, size of vegetation, even the yield that it has produced and what it means going forward. So if we can be able to reset and start from now, we should then be able to use that baseline then to be able to track it as we go forward. Without the baseline, it's very difficult to be able to compare where we started and where we're actually going. So those are some of the things we need to be able to do.
That's a great point too, is how do you actually mark progress if you don't have the data of where we were and where we're going? I want to talk a little bit about how, transformation out of climate change could also be an opportunity in the response. How can we use this as an opportunity to actually remake the food system into something that is more sustainable going forward?
Well, thinking about this conversation about what is a sustainable local food system. And I think there's more talk in certain contexts about that. And how does that become a dominant narrative? In the same way, analogous of during COVID, what it unleashed was a recognition of inequality and income inequality, things that were not talked about as often. And right now, I think there's the compounding, supercharged nature of what's happening, and can be, as you say, an opportunity to bring light to, it has to be a moment to reset, apply learnings. Earlier on, you were talking about, oh, have we learned anything from? And we can mark whatever point in time. And actually, the learning has happened. A lot of research is there, and data and information and studies, but the be applying the learning, the political will, the incentives and pressures that get politicized and polarized need to change. And so, looking at sustainable local food systems and how we each play a part in that is going to be key.
Yeah, exactly. We can write a lot of papers about it, but does it change the way that we actually do things? Charles, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's an opportunity for us to get healthy as human beings. That's what it means as part of this process. Because if you look at a typical sustainable diet, its simplest definition is healthy food that also causes the least damage to the environment. There's an opportunity in there. I know it's a complex subject because both sides of the equation, with the consumption side and the production side, right? But if you look at it very carefully, I know the consumption side sometimes can be a little bit emotional. We understand that. I mean, we know today that a kilogram of beef on our table, before we see it, has already caused 99 kilograms into the atmosphere. That's carbon dioxide. If you put it into perspective, 1 kilogram of chicken on our table, how much? 10 kilograms of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Let's talk about beans. 1 kilogram of beans on our table, less than what? Is 0.98 of a kilogram that goes into the atmosphere in terms of carbon dioxide. I know it's complex and it's very difficult, but it's an opportunity for us to be able to understand this, for us to get even healthier. Now, that's the consumption side of the equation. The production side, that's where I think we have a lot more opportunities to be able to do. And I have already indicated the agroecological systems, the agroforestry systems and others that we need to be able to do. This is the time for us to understand that we live in a global ecosystem. And within an ecosystem, whatever happens within that ecosystem has an impact on every unit that is within that ecosystem. So part of it, Theresa, is us educating and letting people understand. This is a time to reset. Abby has already indicated that we can even get healthier and learn to live with this beautiful environment. Without that, I don't know. 30 years from now, I don't know where we're going to be, Theresa.
I would like to think somewhere positive, but it can be hard.
It can be hard, but as I think CD talked about his daughter influencing, I mean, I feel like I am the target of my children's advocacy every day of when they look at what if I bought something and, spending time at the grocery store, like, where am I going to find the thing that doesn't have the plastic and doesn't have the, it's very hard, but that's our future too. It's the next generation of activists who are thinking and critically thinking about what they do, what we do, what others can do, and how they can make a difference.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point too, thinking about how much power consumers have. And in some instances, unfortunately, not a lot, but in other instances, yeah, they can be driving choices. I would love to bring our audience into this conversation, take advantage of the fact that y'all are here in person. If anyone has a question, we've got a roving mic, so feel free to give a little wave, and we can bring you into the conversation. But I would love to talk a little bit about as well the thinking about climate change coming out of the UN Food Systems Summit. I mean, are you both hopeful that we really can maintain attention on this in this moment of crisis?
I think that every one of us in this room, and hopefully everyone watching, has real agency here. And so hope we all have a responsibility and an opportunity to maintain attention and keep hope. There are alternatives, not ones that any of us who it's been our life's work are ready to think about, because we're looking at the macro implications of what's happening with the war in Ukraine, the impact on fuel, food, fertilizer, all the things we've talked about today. And we have to keep hope. We have to keep action. We've seen when the power of people coming together and taking action for climate and for racial equity and racial justice, we know what's possible. And there's been a lot of reckonings over the past several years. And if we can't lose the momentum and the commitment, even when our gaze gets pushed here and there, what do we all do every single day to keep attention, to keep momentum, to keep commitment, to do these things of investing, localizing, diversifying, and incentivizing the right behaviors, how we invest in smallholder farmers and local production. And it's something we just have to keep galvanized around every day.
And it can be hard, right? Like that was quite the laundry list that you just had there to you know, maintain energy on all of that.
I'm, you know, like Abby, I'm also very, very hopeful, just for the word hope itself, because of what hope does for us, enabling us to be able to have that energy and desire to be able to go to face tomorrow. And that is critical where we are today. But I'm also hopeful because there are lots of programs with great results in the world today that we need to be able to go back to and be able to do a lot more of. We can go back to Ethiopia and the Antioquia Valley when the famine happened. Go there today, it's green. Why? Because of what we did at the time. That gives me hope. Because Abby's, organization, my organization, Action Against Hunger, Care International, and others, great programming. We don't need to struggle to find those programs. It has to be available to us and then take to scale. So I'm hopeful.
And adding on that even further, the stories of hope. The Mali in Uganda, who we talked about earlier, or heard about earlier. I mean, these are people who are awe-inspiring every single day. People who are lifting themselves up, doing the hard work, the resilience of the human spirit and the human effort. And it is really, and I think if we can bring those stories to light and remind of the power and privilege we all have to be able to keep that. Yes, there's a lot, but the choices are about our future and about a sustainable world and sustainable food systems that actually support a just and equitable world.
And I think you really can see that energy and enthusiasm from farmers directly, right? You know, they are the first people that want to be empowered and help, solving this problem. I've been in literal fields of corn in Guatemala and having farmers explain to me, oh, this is how we, have learned to cover the ground and take the excess tree cover to keep the moisture in the soil. And you can see, oh, this farmer's doing it. And right next door, this farmer's not. And that's what helps the community sort of understand, okay, maybe we have to make some changes of what we've been doing. It's hard, but when you're in the community and you can see, oh, my yield is going to be twice as much as it had been, even though we still aren't getting any rain, I'm incentivized to actually make these changes.
Absolutely. And just another thought, I think pre-COVID, we all saw some progress, real progress around SDG 2, for example. The needle did move. We know it can be possible. And so how do we, even during times that can feel really dark and overwhelming as we have these compounding crises, remember what is truly possible?
So he's talking about farming, didn't want to say, Theresa, but you brought out the word. I'm a farmer. So when I'm not doing my day job and I go to Ghana, I go to the farm. I'm farming. They do understand what is going on there. Let me give you an example. Last time I visited a small stream that I grew up in that village. It had never bursted banks before. Very small. This time around, all over the place. And everybody's talking about it. They don't know that it's caused by climate change, but they know it's not good for the environment. So they're worried. That's what we see at the ground. They do understand it. So what we need to do is to be able to continue to encourage them, give them examples of what has worked in other places, take them to those places. They will be able to learn from it. And from that, I think we should be able to do some good stuff and be able to do it well. So.
Well, I think that's the perfect note to end on. A little bit of optimism from this panel as well. Abby, Charles, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you.